Good morning. My name is Sam. I am an alcoholic and I'm also a son of recovery. Let's start out with the Serenity Prayer. Good and gracious God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. So I've been reading through the book called 12 Secular Steps, and we're in the part about the biology of addiction. I'm dividing this up into about 3 sections because it's a big chapter. So I'm on section 2. The path to addiction is paved with reward. Operant conditioning, especially the reward side of the equation, is very relevant in the creation and progression of addiction. During our early experiences with mood-altering drugs, the consistent pairing of drug use with large dopamine rewards results in a repetitive and powerful positive reinforcement of their use. The brain is learning on multiple levels that drug use equals pleasure. If this drug use becomes very frequent, the user faces the grave danger that they may develop an addictive drive. Some drives, like the hunger and thirst drives, are strongly linked to our basic physiological needs and well-being. These drives are innate, which means they are hardwired and active at birth. But as we grow and learn, the reward center can cooperate with other brain areas, like the frontal lobe, a brain area where we will explore shortly, to create new drives. Drives created as we grow and develop are called acquired or adaptive drives, and they are often associated with social and other complex behaviors. Acquired drives are primarily concerned with helping an individual learn to function in their external environment. And as such, it makes sense that they are linked to process like operant conditioning. We interact with people. We interact with people. They give us feedback on our actions, and based on this feedback, we either repeat or abstain from these same actions in the future. This is a very common process during childhood, when social drive information is an important part of our growth and development. As infants, we instinctively look out for ourselves, but as our world grows to include playmates, we'll learn through their feedback that it's wise to share at least some of the time. Once created, the drive is physically written into the brain like software is on a hard drive. The drive will now perform its function by producing motivation. Motivation linked to a drive is often strong enough to be experienced as an internal stress, a need to engage in the behaviors related to the drive. As an example of this sort of drive creation, let's say a middle or high school age kid decides to try out for a sport and one day shows up for practice activity. During the tryout, the coach is encouraging and praising the kid's performance, which makes the kid feel good inside. Positive reinforcement, reward. The kid predictably shows up for more practices, and the positive reinforcement continues. The repeated engagement of the activity is evidence of a growing motivation to play the sport. Fast forward a year or so, and we find that the kid is a valued and very competitive member of the team. We now also observe that the coach often gives critical, seemingly negative feedback on the kid's performance. The negative feedback is not at all discouraging and has no effect on continued activity with the sport. Early in the process, this criticism would have led to avoidance, but presently, the kid has a robust internal need or drive to stay engaged in the sport. The kid even feels anxious when he or she hasn't played for a while. The existence of a well-established drive is observable through the visible high level of motivation the individual has for engaging in an activity despite obstacles. Also, the absence of the activity creates stress. Drives can make us feel like we have purpose, or it may feel like a need, a hole to be filled. Drives have a subconscious side to them that can powerfully influence our conscious state. In active addiction, that means our conscious mind will often be centered on figuring out the details and strategies needed to keep using and drinking, and it may be years before we ask ourselves, is my using all the time okay, or is it a problem? The pathological addictive drive outcompetes normal drives. Many drugs of abuse will cause much larger dopamine rewards than activities associated with normal drives. Because of this, the addictive drive, once formed, has the potential to quickly outcompete our normal drives. As normal drives weaken, the typical addict spends less time engaged in adaptive, but less exciting behaviors, such as socializing with family and friends, or doing well at work or school. Instead, addicts increasingly engage with activities and people associated with heavy alcohol and drug use. As the addictive drive strengthens, many addicts tend to engage in increasingly risky or illegal behaviors. The addictive drive at this point may have profoundly reprogrammed the person. As addiction progresses, the affected person may romanticize or glorify the excitement associated with drug use and culture. The reality, though, is that addiction is a trench, not a ladder. The addict's world is not opening up. It is getting much smaller and more narrowly focused on a singular task, feeding the addiction. Addictive drives are associated with addictive triggers. Drug-associated sights, a cold beer, and people, my buddies at the bar, can act as powerful triggers to set off the desire to seek out and use drugs. AA has long advised newcomers to avoid the people, places, and things associated with use, and this is very wise advice. By the way, triggers can retain this psychological influence for years, and they are a major cause of relapse, even after decades of clean time. Addictive remodeling of the brain has permanent features. The physical changes in the brain of an addict will, at some extent, be permanent. For instance, it has long been known that alcoholics who stop drinking at a mid or late stage of the progression can remain sober for years, yet, if they drink again, perhaps with the intent to moderate this time, they will very quickly return to the same late stage of progression they were in when they previously stopped. It's also important to keep in mind that if we have developed a serious addiction to one substance or behavior, the addictive pattern will easily transfer to others. It's depressing for me to think about how many addicts I've seen overcome alcoholism or narcotic use, then afterwards transition to another destructive addiction like gambling. This form of substitution can also occur many years after recovery from a previous form of addiction. Addiction rewires critical areas of the brain. To add more depth to our study of the biological basis of addiction, we should explore two important brain regions affected by addictive reprogramming: the limbic system, midbrain, and the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex. The limbic system is a region of the brain where the reward center is located. The frontal lobe, especially the outer layer known as the prefrontal cortex, is home to our executive functions, which include our conscious abilities to use judgment and make reasoned decisions. The limbic system. The brain structures collectively known as the limbic system, indicated in one of the gray areas in the figure below, and there is a figure, are found in the mid-interior of the brain, like where you'd find a pit within a peach, except it is located a little forward and pushed downward toward the base of the brain. The Oxford English Dictionary defines the limbic system as a complex system of nerves and networks in the brain involving several areas near the edge of the cortex concerned with instinct and mood. It controls the basic emotions, fear, pleasure, and anger, and drives hunger, sex, dominance, care of offspring. Notice that the limbic system we find the spinal cord. Nerve tracts in the spinal cord bring sensory information, sight, sounds, and touch, from the outside world into the brain. The limbic system and frontal lobe filter this information, ignoring most of it, while focusing attention on select stimuli deemed relevant to our interests and drives. The sensory information about people, places, and things associated with drug use triggers travel through the spinal cord and enter the limbic system. Once selected as relevant to the addictive drive and associated rewards, these insights and sounds simultaneously trigger several brain systems to coordinate with each other and hastily seize upon an opportunity to use. Even the rational part of the brain is now hijacked to use its powers and strategize on how best to get the drug, rather than questioning the sanity of this activity. Limbic personality traits. The limbic system is very dominant in infantile behavior and by its very nature is self-centered. This overt selfishness is not always a bad thing, necessarily, and it serves a purpose early in human development. A newborn, for instance, possesses innate self-centeredness as a survival mechanism. It draws attention to itself by crying to ensure it receives food and attention and doesn't get left behind. A helpless infant's forlorn wailing often elicits sympathy. Likewise, a 2-year-old child is developing its identity, me first, and has not yet developed the social awareness that brain function to regulate behavior and see beyond the immediate self. This explains the extreme displays of emotion when a toddler doesn't get its way. These outbursts are often so irrational and ridiculous that they are humorous if irritating. And while self-centeredness is appropriate in developing brains, it is not at all appropriate or endearing in a 40-year-old addict who has, for all intents and purposes, regressed to terrible twos in terms of both emotional maturity and social awareness. In emergencies, the limbic system can take command of the mind because it houses the high-voltage flight or fight system. If a rabid dog comes after us, reflex will prove more decisive than reflexive. During well-established active addiction, the limbic system is often operating at a priority level above the lower voltage rational brain, and limbic-related self-centered behavior becomes predominant. The selfish ego, id in Freudian lingo, otherwise known as king baby of the universe, is also housed largely in the limbic system and part of the frontal lobe that it borders. The king baby wants what he wants, and he wants it right now. King baby rarely thinks of consequences and generally cannot place the needs of others above his own self-centered wants. If you know someone in advanced stages of addiction, this may sound kind of familiar. The cerebrum is the portion of the brain above and surrounding the limbic system. This is the largest and most highly developed part of the brain. It forms something like a thick, fleshy helmet that is divided into right and left halves, the right brain and the left brain. The outermost layer of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and it is a folded and furrowed appearance like the outer surface of a walnut. The cerebral cortex is associated with advanced functions like math, reasoning, and language. The frontal lobe is a part of the cerebrum just underneath the forehead and extending back to the temples. The wrinkled outer layer, covering much of the frontal lobe, is called the prefrontal cortex. The complex functions linked to the prefrontal cortex include abstract thinking and problem solving, decision making, conscious right and wrong, and judgment, inhibiting impulsiveness and antisocial behavior. Unlike the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system is associated with emotions, primal needs, the fight or flight reactions, and impulsive behaviors. The limbic system, along with some of the adjacent frontal lobe, probably make up much of our subconscious mind. As we develop and mature, the brain is gradually programmed to assign executive functions to the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, and allow its rational powers to make many of the decisions for day-to-day operations. Complex communication skills, good judgment, and a conscious morality are processes and skills that develop over years of childhood and our early childhood. And these cortex-based abilities regularly function to inhibit destructive, aggressive, and impulsive behaviors. In short, through progressive maturing and programming of the cortex, we become less self-centered and more social. It is through cortex development that we gain the ability to communicate with others and take part in adult life more fully. And that is where I'm going to stop for today. We will continue and finish Chapter 2 later. But it actually is really interesting, and I think it's very important for us to really understand the biology of addiction, and what is going on in our brain, and how drugs and alcohol affect the reward center, and our ability to empathize with others, and because that's really one of the things I heard in there was them almost saying empathy, like as we continue we lose empathy and we are just becoming more self-centered. And I relate to that fully when I think back on my time drinking and what was going on in my life then. So with that, I'm going to open up a prayer. Love. Higher power, remind me that love is patient, love is kind, love is not jealous, it does not put on airs, and it is not snobbish. Love is never rude, it is not self-seeking, it is not prone to anger, neither does it brood over injuries. Love does not rejoice in what is wrong, but rejoices with the truth. There is no limit to love's forbearance, its truth, its hope, its power to endure. That is a wonderful prayer for today. So as always, if you have any thoughts or questions or comments, please leave them. And as always, I hope you have a blessed day.